The talk today is going to center on what I learned about as a docent at the Fire Island Lighthouse and what I learned about Fire Island maritime history and what became the inspiration for my historical fiction, Shipwreck of Hopes, which is the wreck of the Elizabeth off the shores of Fire Island in 1850. So in the novel, the reader is swept from our Long Island shores across the Atlantic Ocean to war-torn Europe and back again with the ship to witness the wreck of the Elizabeth. So the research that was involved had these 3 settings in it, and it's going to be all 3 of those settings are the topics of today's presentation, which is the importance of the Fire Island Lighthouse and its location, the inception of a shore-based life-saving system in America, and how and why the wreck of the Elizabeth affected the development and growth of that life-saving system. So there's a lot to cover today. Strap yourselves in. We're going to be all over the map, all right? So speaking of maps, I love maps. You're going to see a lot of maps today. So here we are. We're all Long Islanders, so you're familiar with this, but I like to just point out all of the barrier beaches along the South Shore here. Coney Island, Long Beach Island, Jones Beach Island, Fire Island, and here's Fire Island. And right about here is where the Fire Island Lighthouse is. This map gives you an idea, a different idea of the location. Wait, did we skip? No, okay. So here's the inlet as it exists. What I want to show you here is this is the location of the Fire Island Lighthouse. Here is the inlet. So if you're trying to get into the Great South Bay, you have to take your boat all the way around like this. So as a docent, a lot of times visitors ask me, why did they build a lighthouse in the middle of the island? So I point out that they didn't build it in the middle of the island. At the time they built the first lighthouse, which was 1848, that was the end of the island. So what happened is littoral drift. Littoral drift is a constant pushing westward of the ocean currents and the gathering of the sand into the extension of what was Fire Island and now is extended all the way out here. So basically, all of Robert Moses State Park is additional to where the Fire Island Lighthouse was originally built. So here is a very cool map that I love, Samuel Wheeler's survey map from 1789. This shows you the inlet and the condition it was back in that day. So George Washington asked Samuel Wheeler to make a map of the shores. And what do we see here? Well, whoops. We see Captree Islands and the 4 islands in here, which we now know as East Fire Island, West Fire Island, Sexton Island. All these islands were on the inlet. And look at how this was West Beach, what was now the end of Jones Beach Island, Oak Beach, right? And here, this was called East Beach, what we now call Fire Island. But let's take a look at what it says on the map, which I think is so cool. The Great Fear, F-I-E-R, Island Inlet, or ship's channel carrying over the bar 2 fathoms of water. The channel over the bar. So it's letting the next captains know there's 2 fathoms of water if you want to get your boat safely into the Great South Bay. So I love this because lots of times as a docent, I'm also asked, how did Fire Island get its name? And there's all kinds of great folklore-y stories about that. And I think there's always an element of truth in folklore. That's why it's folklore. But when I look at this map and I say Fear Island Inlet, F-I-E-R, I realize I remember the Dutch maps. I see you have a copy of an old Dutch map. But the Dutch maps that had this called the Veer Island Inlet, V-I-E-R, Dutch Veer is the number 4. So the 4 Island Inlet, I think, is what it was originally called, and that got transposed to Fear, and you can easily see how that turns into fire, as in Fire Island. So this is part of the story of the importance of the Fire Island lighthouse and the importance historically. This red line is the shipping lanes that come in from Europe. So think about the early 1800s, before the age of steam. You're coming under sail from Europe. You would leave Europe, and 2 months later, the first man-made light you would see was the Fire Island Light. I mean, think about that, right? So where are they all going? They're going to New York Harbor, and I'll explain why in a minute. Now, most of us here are Long Islanders, so we know that the Montauk Lighthouse is older than the Fire Island Light. So why don't they see that light? Because look at the distance between Montauk and the shipping lanes. The light was not able to be seen from down here, which is why right here, which is where the Fire Island Light is, was so essential to herald lights into New York Harbor. So again, think of the time period. We're talking about the early 1800s, 1820s. The country was only like 35 years old, right? Washington wasn't inaugurated until 1789. And so here we are trying to build a brand new country. There's no infrastructure in this country. So what do you need to build a country? You need two things. You need money and you need people. And in those days, the only way you're getting either of those in was by ship. So the fact that the Fire Island Lighthouse was conducting these ships into our harbor safely, I can't overstate the importance of the Fire Island Lighthouse to the growth of this country. Over time, Fire Island, the New York Harbor began to grow and grow and grow even more because of this. The Erie Canal, so we all studied that in fourth grade social studies where we didn't know what was going on and why it was important, but now I know why it was important. The Erie Canal opened up all of the middle part of the country, all the good stuff, the crops, the timber, the skins, everything that you could sell, opened it up to come down the Hudson River and out for trade. So now New York Harbor became a huge international port with all this other good stuff that they could trade and sell. So the Erie Canal caused New York Harbor to grow to the point where it was doing more than 60% of all the harbor business out of all the harbors in this country. So again, can't be overstated how important the Fire Island Lighthouse is. So more and more ships coming in, more and more shipwrecks, right? So we love our beaches, right? That's why we live here. We love those beaches. They're gorgeous, but they're treacherous with sandbars. So if you're in Boston Harbor and there's a pile of rocks over here, you can tell the next captain there's a pile of rocks over there, right? But sandbars aren't in one place. They move around with every storm. They're treacherous. And back then, there was no way to see down into the water. So these guys, there was a lot of foundering of boats on the sandbars. The federal government realized they needed to create a system of coastal safety, and that involved two things. Lighthouses was one thing, and the other one was a shore-based life-saving system. So here's the original lighthouse. It's not the one that's there now. This one was built in 1826 as a direct result of the opening of the Erie Canal. 80 feet tall, like half the height of today's lighthouse. It was octagonal in shape. It was made of Connecticut bluestone. And it served its purpose for a while until they realized there was still a lot of shipwrecks. And they realized that the 80-foot tower, you know, light travels in a straight line, right? The 80-foot tower didn't have the light high enough over sea level to get the light out past the curvature of the earth to where the shipping lanes were. So that's why this tower had to come down, and in 1858, they built the tower that we now have standing today. So this picture shows you a rendition of the guys who were building the lighthouse tower back in the day. Fire Island was desolate at the time. There was no other structures. There were some temporary fishermen's shacks. Dominy eventually ended up building a sportsman's hotel there that was only open in season. It happened to be open during the shipwreck, which was very helpful. But in addition to these lighthouses for coastal safety, we want to look at the shore-based life-saving system. So the Life-Saving Benevolent Association was formed, and they originally built 10 life-saving huts on Long Island. So that's what this is. Oops. I'm not used to having a pointer and a clicker all in the same unit. So anyway, so these were like little one-car garages. little shacks that they built along the beach, and they put all the life-saving equipment inside of it, so it was there ready to go in case there was a shipwreck. When I was doing my research, I like to find original documents whenever I can, so I was able to find some of the original documents that were made of the Life-Saving Benevolent Association, which is now part of the Seamen's Institute housed in Queens College. And they were very generous about making the research appointment, and they took all the letters that were exchanged about the building of this system, and they put them into letter books. So I like this one. I want to take a picture of it and show it to you because these are the 10 original life-saving stations on Long Island. So you could see the distance. We have Moriches, Mastic, Fire Island, Long Beach, and Barren Island. Barren Island was Coney Island. So there was not enough money to build a lot of them. They built them as best that they could, and they were about like 10 miles distance between. This is a letter written by Walter Restored Jones, who was the head of the Life-Saving Benevolent Association, dated September 24th, 1849. He's asking for a report on the construction of the lighthouses. I just get a tickle out of seeing this old stuff that's so important about our own backyard and the history here. Now, the equipment that was housed in those little huts. Here's an idea of what it was. So first of all, there's the lighthouse. Here is a cart that was used to transport all that equipment down the beach to the site of the shipwreck. Here's your ailing ship who's stuck on a sandbar. And this is what's called a Lyle gun. It is a little cannon, basically, a little cannon that would shoot a hawser or a heavy rope out to the ailing ship with a plaque on it that had instructions on that they should attach the hawser to the mast. And then they would set up a block and tackle kind of situation. So now you had connection with the shore. So they would haul in and out from the block and tackle. So what did they haul in and out? A breeches buoy. So what's that? A breeches buoy is a buoy with a pair of breeches or pants sewn into it so that when you got into the buoy, you didn't slip out the bottom. Well, that's good thinking, right? Got to be practical. So here's a picture of, this is an oil painting that we have inside the lighthouse. By the way, if you haven't been to the lighthouse, you do have to come. So here's some of the stuff in operation. Here's the lifeboat that they're trying to get out to the ship that's stuck on the sandbar. There's all this happy survivors. And this guy has climbed the mast and he's waiting his turn. This guy is in the breeches buoy being hauled in with the block and tackle like we used to haul in our laundry from the backyard. And that's only if you were lucky, because lots of times, I mean, these storms happened in the wintertime. The conditions were too terrible to be able to get the lifeboat out or for the Lyle gun to be able to get the hawser out. So these are all very lucky survivors right there. Here's an example. These are the guys with all that stuff in the cart, hauling it down to the wreck site, which could be miles away, by hand in the surf. Can you imagine that? I know what, I go to the beach and I have to carry my beach chair down to this water and I get tired. Like, how did these guys even do this? I don't know. But here, look at this one. Here they are getting a lifeboat out. Right?
Yeah.
And by the way, these are all volunteers in the beginning.
Mm-hmm. They do have life jackets on.
They have, and look at the life jackets. I'm glad you pointed that out. So these are corks, right? And they just sewed the cork together. That was the high-tech equipment of the day. And it really was. Check this one out. Right? So here's a very hopeful survivor who wants to get into this lifeboat, and here's what the conditions were really like when these boats would wreck. No easy task, not for the faint of heart. And again, mostly in the wintertime. And they didn't have any EMS technical clothing. They got wet, they stayed wet. A lot of them ended up with pneumonia and not surviving that, even if they survived the activity of this.
Did most of the rescuers live on Fire Island, or did they come across from back?
Very few people lived on Fire Island at this time. It was the lighthouse and the fisherman shacks in season. So yes, they had to come from across the bay. So it was not an easy task to get these volunteers to show up. So again, if you're in Boston Harbor and you have a life-saving hut, you can go knock on doors and get people to come. There's no doors on Fire Island at the time. There was no people. So it was not a good system for a deserted barrier island, right? We have this in the lighthouse too. So when you come, you'll see this. It's on the second floor. This is it's a map of Wreck Valley, which is what we're a part of Wreck Valley. Here we are. Wreck Valley is the south coast of Long Island and the coast of New Jersey, all trying to get into this little tiny neck to get into New York Harbor. Kind of a mean trick. After you've been at sea for 2 months and you're coming along the shipping lanes, now all of a sudden you have to get into here with all these, it's like going through the gauntlet, right? So all of these names, every single piece of writing you see on here is the name of a shipwreck in Wreck Valley. Thousands of wrecks across here. I mean, think about what I was saying before, 60% of the business since the early 1800s. The Dutch were here first. We have shipwrecks from the 1600s. So you can imagine how important New York Harbor was and how busy it was and then how treacherous it was.
Is that how they get Hell's Gate? Because it was a hellish type of...
Hell's Gate, I think, is on the north, is the approach from in here, which I think is even worse, which is why they didn't use it. They came across on the south. So then you might be asking yourself, well, if there's all these thousands of wrecks, why did she pick the Elizabeth to write about? All right, well, good question. Thank you for asking. So the wreck of the Elizabeth. I was interested in this wreck for a lot of reasons. One was this poor ship had trouble from the start. It left Italy for New York Harbor on May 23rd, and it crashed into our shore on July 19th, right? Basically a 2-month journey. And they didn't have any good luck from the start. The captain died of smallpox by the time they reached Gibraltar. So they didn't get very far. So a burial at sea, and now the inexperienced first mate, Henry Bangs, ends up captaining the ship across the ocean. Now, they didn't have a bad journey across the ocean because there's basically nothing to crash into, and the weather was good. So they made it across the ocean. But my second interest, now I'm a retired English teacher, so here comes a ship that crashed on our shores involving my lighthouse, my beach, and there's a female writer on board the ship. So I'm like, this is my story. I've been waiting to write something, and this is it. So who is the female writer who was on board the ship? Margaret Fuller. Oh, good, somebody knows her. Because she's kind of fallen out of favor. But she was super important in her day. So I have to talk a little bit about her. She was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1810. Her father was a state senator of Massachusetts. Now just think, 1810, how old is the country, right? The father was one of the first, senators, and he saw the promise in her. She was quite brilliant little girl, and he tutored his Harvard education right into her little brain from the age of 3. She was reading in Latin and Greek by the age of 6. I mean, she was like, yeah, but he was the son of a Puritan minister. So you can imagine there was no yeah, exactly. But there was also no cartoons and fun stuff going on in their house. It was brought up very, very strictly, and so was she by him. But she was very unusual because women weren't allowed to go to college back in those days. So she had this great college education in her brain because of her father. So it was a lonely life. Like the other little girls wanted to play dolls, and there she is talking about Dante's Inferno and stuff. So it was not easy. But she became part of that the Cambridge Brain Trust, the transcendentalists. So she was friends with Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, very good friends with Thoreau because he was more her age. So what did she do? Thoreau and Emerson, and she and others, but they thought what was going on at the time is that Americans were looking across the ocean for culture, art, literature. Everything came from Europe back then. And they said, wait a minute, this is America now. We have to develop our own voice, the American literary voice. So they decided to put together a literary journal. And this literary journal was called, The Dial. And Margaret Fuller was the editor of the first literary journal in America. It's pretty important and with very high purpose. The other thing that she was very well known for, whoops, there we go again. Oh no, stop that. She was known for her book called Woman in the 19th Century, because she was trying to consider, in this new country, with all these revolutionary ideas and all these new structure of our country, what would the woman's role be in this country? This was really popular. Every printing got sold out. She had to print again and got sold out. So she got a lot of notoriety, and this notoriety caught the attention of this guy, Horace Greeley, who was starting his brand new newspaper called the New York Tribune. So he got in touch with her and asked her to come down to New York and to be his literary editor for the newspaper. So she did. She left Cambridge and came down to New York to live. So I just said that in one sentence, right? However, in 1840, single women didn't move to New York by themselves. This was a very bold woman and a very bold move. 1840s, women didn't just go to New York and get a job, right? But she did. So when she first came down, she lived with the Greeleys, who lived up in Turtle Bay, which is like where the UN is now, for just a few months. And then she was too far away from the Tribune office, which was down by where Pace University is now. So she left them, went down there, got rooms in a boarding house, and took herself to where all the action was. So like a lot of us in this room, I can tell, we all saw the old show on television, That Girl, remember That Girl, oh, yeah. Right? So Marlo Thomas moves to the city and she's in the street throwing a hat up in the air and all that. There was no hat throwing in the 1840s for a woman on her own. So we have to really appreciate who she was and her boldness. So here I found a picture of the old Tribune office. Isn't that cool?
Excuse me, did her father oppose?
He was dead by then.
Oh, okay.
So honestly, and that was a very rough thing because he died young. She had like 5 brothers and sisters. She was the eldest, and so it fell to her to support the family. So she took teaching jobs, she was writing, she was teaching, and she was, because the father, I shouldn't go off on that, but you had to ask. So the father left all the money to his brother. And his brother didn't approve of Margaret. So he didn't come forth with the money to support the family, right? So it was her responsibility to make sure the youngest siblings got educated and all that. So and that was a good question. So by the time this invitation came, she was able to loose herself from that because the kids were all settled. And she did come down here.
And they never got the money?
No, the uncle took, yeah, I know. That's another story. I should write that one. So anyway, and I'm glad you said that because of that, like people of that ilk, usually when they finish their education, they would have the European tour. Well, she never got the chance to do the European tour because she was busy taking care of her siblings, right? So she's living in New York City now. She's making a whole bunch of new friends. She's a literary editor. She meets Rebecca and Marcus Spring, who asked her to come to Europe with them. And she never had a chance to go to Europe, so she said yes. So 1848, she goes to Europe. Now, so here I am. I'm trying to research this little shipwreck, right, on Long Island. And I end up with the life of Margaret Fuller. And now I have to end up with this. The 1848 European rebellions. So, what was going on in Europe? Well, everything, right? All of the monarchs, they were all being challenged now by their people. So France, the Austrian Empire, Prussia, Hungary, Bohemia, rebellions were everywhere, bloody rebellions in the street. The kings were being forced to exile, or if they were smart, they would create constitutional monarchies if they didn't want to exile. But it was a bloody mess, literally a bloody mess over there in 1848. And now here comes Margaret Fuller. She traveled to Europe during that time. So what was going on? It was the Europeans now are looking across the ocean at us and saying, hey, wait a minute, how come those people get to elect their officials? And how come those people get, representation in the government and we're under these kings and queens for generations and we're living like peasants? So it was really an era of a great shift in social consciousness. So here comes Margaret Fuller sailing into the middle of that, literally. So she ends up visiting Rome and gets involved in the Italian Revolution of 1848. Now, just to refresh your memory, what was going on there? So the Papal States, Rome and the Papal States that went straight across the country, that was always in charge of the Pope. Everything north of that was in charge of the Austrian Empire. Here, Sardinia France was in charge of that. And then everything south of Rome, including Sicily, was in charge of King Ferdinand of Spain. So the Italians are going, oh, what are all of these people doing here? Like basically, Italy should be for the Italians. So the bloody revolution started. Now, remembering her background, her father, and it was not that long ago that we got rid of King George, right? So she felt the heart of it. She got involved in it, and she also got involved with the handsome young Marchese, Giovanni Asili. And so she ended up abandoning her friends. They went off on the rest of the European journey, and she stayed in Italy. So, Italian Revolution of 1848, bloody battles, cannonade, taking down the old Roman buildings, and here she is in the middle of it. So she's writing like crazy. She's still employed by Horace Greeley. So she's sending articles back to Horace Greeley that get printed in his New York Tribune about the Italian Revolution, and she's begging for Americans to recognize the revolution and the veracity of it. So just as a little bit more of an aside, in Italy, her contribution is noted. So here, this is on her address in Rome, where she lived on the Via del Corso. This is on her address with Giovanni Asili, where they lived for like a year or so in Rieti, a little town north of Rome. And then here they named a little street in Rome after her, because it's well noted what her work was with the revolution.
She kept her maiden name as well as the husband's name.
Yeah.
Which was not really used
No.
at that time.
Well, Margaret Fuller Asili. So there's arguments among Fuller scholars whether or not she actually married him. So I spent a lot of time on this. Oh, listen to her. Ooh, she didn't marry her. But we have letters that she wrote to her mom. And I went up to Harvard University. Fuller family papers are up at Harvard University. And I read letters and documents from her. And she was writing about Asili. And when you follow this town of Rieti, which is where the baby was born, it's very plausible to me, although they don't have the marriage certificate, because when she knew when everything was falling apart, she gave her stuff to the American consulate in Rome. But it's very plausible that it went like this. This is my version of this. So they're not married. Here's the baby. They're taking him to be baptized because her husband was strict Catholic and wanted a baptism. She was Protestant. But she loved her husband, and this is what he wanted. Because their name, the Asili name, is in the book, the Golden Book of Italian Royalty or something like that. So that meant a lot to him. Anyway, I'm picturing this. They bring the baby into this little tiny church, and the priest is standing there, and they have the baby, and his brother and somebody else was there as the godparents, and they're not married. So the priest goes like this. You're married? Okay, psst, on the baby, now he's baptized, we're done. That's what I really think that she was married, but it wasn't like a,
Talk about a shotgun wedding.
Anyway. Oh. What? Oh, Sarah? Her real first name is Sarah. It's Sarah Margaret. Mom was a very tough mother, so she calls herself Margaret. She called herself Margaret. Okay, so anyway, let's get back on board the ship. So, the revolution failed because the Italian Revolution, where they did get their independence, wasn't until the 1860s, right? This was the first attempt and it didn't work out. So if you're on the losing side of a revolution, you better beat it out of town. And so there they are, they're coming back home on the Elizabeth. Now, we've been covering a lot of territory, right? So we started out with the development of the lighthouse and life-saving system on the South Shore. Then we had Margaret Fuller's life in America, and then Margaret Fuller's life in Rome, and then the European revolutions of 1848. So here comes the last great story I'm going to tell you about, which is actually the wreck of the Elizabeth and what happened on our shores. So remember, the captain was dead, and the first mate is bringing the ship in. So the next slide is going to show you the two fatal errors of the approach to New York Harbor. Now, there's two fatal errors, and they involve some bad luck and some bad judgment. So bad luck number one is that this guy, Henry Bangs, who never captained a ship into New York Harbor, comes right into the midst of a gigantic hurricane. Right, so he, that hurricane, I researched the hurricanes. They were able to find, all the newspaper reports, and it started around Baltimore and swept all the way up the coast to New England. And so I followed the newspaper reports of that hurricane, destruction all the way up the coast for days, but of course they had no way to communicate back then on the ships. You were just out of luck. So bad judgment the bad judgment part had two pieces to it. One was that he misjudged the heaviness of the wind and the effect it would have. And I know this because there were survivors from this wreck, other sailors, and they were interviewed, and I read the interviews. And by the way, guess who did some of the interviews? Henry David Thoreau, who came down here and spent 5 days on Fire Island looking for anything of Margaret Fuller's. So that's another interesting story, but I digress again. So here he comes after 2 months at sea, coming in here, and there's this heavy wind. So he says, oh, good, there's a heavy wind coming in from the south. It's going to push us up into New York Harbor even sooner. Go pack your trunks. We'll be in New York Harbor by dawn. So the other first mate and other sailors said that he should have known that wind heralded something different than that. So then the other part of his misjudgment was this. They're coming in here. He sees a flashing light from a lighthouse. And he said, oh, good. Here we are right off of Sandy Hook. And here we are. We're going to get right into New York Harbor over there. But guess what? What lighthouse was he actually seeing? Fire Island light. So he thought he was coming up here, but instead he set a course straight north, right for disaster. I know, right? It was such an interesting story. So here's another, I think there's like 12 maps in this thing, right? So this is a hand-drawn map. I drew it because I want to show you where the ship came in. The wreck of the Elizabeth is here. Here's the Fire Island Lighthouse. Remember I said it was on the end of the island. Guess how far away the ship wrecked from the life-saving station? 5 miles. The life-saving stations were 10 miles apart. You couldn't be further away from a life-saving station, right? So that means that the lightkeeper had to go find people to show up during a hurricane, get that heavy equipment, put it on a cart, get it down the beach 5 miles to the wreck of the Elizabeth. So that's why things didn't work out so well. By the time they got the stuff down, by the time they gathered the people, got the stuff down there, the tide had turned. The Lyle gun was going against the wind and couldn't get the hawser out. And the surf was so terrible they couldn't get the surf boat out. So all the equipment just sat there, and they were on board the ship there for hours, not being able to be rescued. So therefore, an unmanned life-saving system on a deserted barrier island is not such a good idea. So where normally, I mean, you saw all those wrecks, right, on that wreck map? Wreck reports were normally like page 3 one-liners used by the underwriters for insurance purposes. Well, this one got first page, unending newspaper reports for months and months and months and months. And I'm not exaggerating, just months of newspaper reporting. Well, first of all, first reason was because somebody famous on board was killed. So it's just like if something happens to you and me, nobody would care. But if you're famous, everybody is tooting and tweeting and everything. So nothing changes under the sun. She was famous and she got all the press. The second reason there was a lot of press was what I like to call Long Islanders' bad behavior. Right. Looting. So people were showing up while they were on board the ship and picking up all the silks and Italian wool and olive oil and almonds and all this stuff off the sand. So all these people were doing that, and there was an outrage because of it. So newspaper reports and newspaper reports. So to be honest with you, wreckers or land pirates, they were called, it was part of the local economy. Right? I mean, people were waiting for these ships to come in because they knew they were going to get, all these riches. Frankly, it was like when a ship came in, it was like Christmas morning and Santa just came. They would just come running down and picking up everything that they could find. Lots of newspaper coverage, lots of outrage because of that. And so with all, God bless, with all of this reporting and investigating, for a researcher, I got names of people. I found out who was involved in the wreck. I was able to go on genealogical websites and find their families. And I even went to the graveyards. It sounds creepy, but it was so cool because they're buried right around here. And you got their stories. And I was able to make the characters, they're actual people. Every character in Shipwreck of Hopes is an actual Long Islander who was involved in the wreck. When you're reading about the stuff in Rome, every person, a general, or anybody that's in there, stuff that I researched, they're actual people. So it was good for research purposes to have all this publicity.
Did any of those people who looted go to jail? Or?
Well, listen, they were very good at it. So they knew to take it, bury it, secret it away. So all these 40 people, because of all the outrage, were investigated, but they couldn't find stuff, or it wasn't enough to make a thing out of, so that actually only 7 people ended up getting arrested. And a lot of these names, they were connected names. They were like big names down here, and everything just ended up disappearing. But I want to say one of the heroes is a Babylon native, Sella Carl Strong, as in Carl's Path, the Carl, C-A-R-L-L-S. Sella Strong was a Babylon resident, and then he lived on Fire Island because he and his wife were the lightkeepers down there. So it was he who took care of the light. It was he who gathered the people, the lifesavers, to get down the beach. He figures heavily into the story, as he well should. So he was a Carl on his mother's side, but he was also the cousin of Sella Brewster Strong of the North Shore Strongs, the Culper Spy Ring, right? And then also of interest on the side is his wife, Susan Emmeline Vale, and her cousin. She also had a famous cousin, Alfred Vale, who was the partner of Samuel Morse. Oh. Right, and the Vales, he and the other Vales were in New Jersey because they used to go back and forth and visit all the time. Interesting, right? So, the national importance of this wreck is the extraordinary extent of the publicity of the wreck of the Elizabeth exposed the utter failure of the life-saving system as it existed. You can't have a volunteers force. It showed the flaws in those expectations of a volunteer-based unmanned service, and that caused enough pressure on Congress to appropriate funds to have manned uniformed crews and life-saving stations, real life-saving stations. So remember the life-saving hut I showed you looking like a one-car garage? So eventually what they did was first of all, the appropriations came years apart, so they were building it a little at a time. So they put more of those stations up so that they weren't 10 miles apart. And then they improved the stations, so the new stations ended up looking like this, because they had uniformed crews that were manned there 24 hours. These guys did beach patrols along the beach. So this was the life-saving service after the improvements were made. Big difference. So the pressure from the wreck of the Elizabeth caused the improvement of the life-saving system and increased coastal safety and saved thousands of lives. It protected cargo and property. So just to say on that improved life-saving system, between 1878 and 1914, the Fire Island, just the Fire Island U.S. Life-Saving Service aided 721 vessels and saved 7,086 lives. Yeah, that's just our guys. So why between 1878 and 1914? What happened in 1915? This is what happened. So we had the shore-based life-saving system that was all being paid for by the U.S. Treasury. Then we also had the revenue cutter service that had been in effect since the country started. They had the cutter ships, which were the fastest sailing ships, hanging around New York Harbor so that when you came in from Europe with all your goods, they would board your ship, see what you were bringing in, and made sure you paid your import taxes. So revenue cutter service. So what happened in 1915 is they merged the two of those together to form what we now know as the U.S. Coast Guard.
That's customs too, was that customs?
I don't know if the revenue cutter service was customs back in the day, but now, yeah, the Coast Guard does, you know what the Coast Guard does.
You mentioned Morse. Was Morse inspired because of this kind of shipwreck to have some type of communication? Wasn't that on the Titanic, the Morse code or something? That he would be able to communicate with ships for a hurricane warning?
Titanic is so much later though, right? In 1920s? 30s? 1912? Yeah. But see, Samuel Morse and Vail were partners, and they were both working on this system. From what I read, and I didn't study it a lot, but what I read, Vail came up with the idea of the Morse code. But when Morse wanted to take it into like a real business, Vail just wanted to be a scientist. And he's like, I'm out of here. All I want to do is study the science and stuff. So he's parted with Morse at that time. So the importance of the wreck of the Elizabeth and the reason it became the inspiration for me to write the historical fiction was the sad and unnecessary, I think, end of the life of Margaret Fuller, and then the outcry from the public to improve the life-saving system.
Did all the people perish?
No, not all the people. So that's it. Thank you so much for listening.
That was so much.
You guys are great.